And I'm delighted to welcome Helen Vincent, who's Senior Rare Books Curator at the National Library of Scotland. Helen has many areas of expertise, and last year she did an exhibition celebrating the 200th anniversary of the publication of Pride and Prejudice. So I'm really pleased that we're all going to be able to hear her talking tonight on Jane Austen's Scottish sisters. So please give her a warm welcome, Helen Vincent.
In December 2011, the historian and television presenter Amanda Vickery asked Guardian readers, why should Jane Austen survive when so many of her best-selling contemporaries have faded into obscurity? Who reads Susan Ferrier today? Jane Austen's Scottish sisters have not been entirely forgotten, but it's true to say they've not been entirely remembered. While feminist criticism has brought them back to the attention of academics, and they sometimes feature on literature courses on the history of the novel or women's writing, there are no television or film adaptations of their novels, no mass-market editions repackaging them as chick lit for the non-academic reader, no societies devoted to celebrating them, no internet forums buzzing with discussion about whether their heroines married the right men, no fan fiction rewriting the stories or providing sequels. Yet in the early 19th century, some Scottish women such as Mary Brunton and Elizabeth Hamilton were far better known throughout Britain than Jane Austen in the field of the novel, where today she reigns supreme, telling stories of young women entering into adult life about to find their destiny and hopefully their ideal partner. Before Walter Scott, today generally perceived as the founding Scottish novelist, these women penned best-selling tales set in a Scotland instantly recognisable to their contemporaries, documenting local language and customs, and Scott himself was the first to acknowledge the merits of their books. Why have these women lapsed into obscurity? Are they deservedly forgotten? Are their novels dull or implausible, their characters unrealistic, their writing poor? I hope today to convince you that this is not the case, and that they are worth discovering, especially at a time when more than ever before their books are accessible to modern readers. Some of the books I'm going to talk about can be found in modern editions, though perhaps not in any bookshop. Elizabeth Hamilton's Cottages of Librarian was recently republished in a fine edition by the Association for Scottish Literary Studies, and a scholarly edition of Mary Brunton's Self-Control has just appeared last year. But some of these books have not been reprinted, as far as I can tell, for over a century. But in this age of Google Books, Project Gutenberg, and other ways in which old texts are freely available as online editions which can be transferred to any Kindle or e-reader, or reprinted on demand for those who still prefer to hold pages of print in their hand, if you know how, it's almost as easy to obtain a copy of Catherine Sinclair's Modern Accomplishments as it is to find Pride and Prejudice online. Today I would like to bring these novelists back to life, not as subjects of academic study, but as writers whose books can be enjoyed in the year 2014. Perhaps I do need first to overcome the question, why are they not so well known then? I do think the fact that they are both Scottish and female plays a part in this. Although there were many Scottish women who wrote poetry, songs, memoirs, fiction, and other kinds of texts before the middle of the 19th century, few, if any, are ever presented to children in the classroom or allowed out of the scholarly enclosure into the wider world. The canon doesn't have room for everyone. Authors can become representative figures for a larger school of writers. In this sense, we have Walter Scott as the representative Scottish novelist, and Jane Austen as the representative female novelist of the early 19th century, and so there simply doesn't seem room for an author who is both Scottish and female. Secondly, the list of classic novels we have today still bears the echoes of the great tradition, the title of F.R. Leavis's famous book published just after the Second World War, which he began with a blanket assertion that the great English novelists are Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad. Although Leavis himself soon was forced to widen his canon, the idea of the novel as a narrow tradition beginning with Austen, and hence excluding her contemporaries and predecessors, remained. Leavis also embodied a school of thought which found in fiction a replacement for religion as a source of ideas about ethics, morality, and society. The woman I'm going to talk about, whose writings do explicitly reflect their strong Christian faith, can't be read in this way, and were among other novelists whose religiosity rendered them unattractive as time passed and tastes in literature changed. Finally, being Scottish, female, religious, and satirical makes life complicated for an author's critics. It's so much easier to treat one of these elements at a time. But what do you do with a writer who 1 minute heartlessly caricatures the figure of the parish minister, and the next interjects serious comment on the state of her heroine's soul? How do you claim a novelist as part of a national literature when they seem determined to stress the dire need of their country for improvements so that it can be raised to the standard of a certain other country south of the border? Where does a novel focusing on who marries whom fit into a history of fiction, which is looking for what that fiction says about the state of the nation? If you're teaching a course on female novelists, on the other hand, what space can you give to exploring the significance of an author's decision to have one of their characters speak in Scots and another in English? These are all questions for scholars, and I think they do need some scholarly consideration. But what I want to do today is much less academic. I hope to persuade you to read these books, whether you download them to your e-reader, seek out the surprisingly cheap second-hand copies, demand your local library stock the modern editions, or go and quarry the resources of St Andrews University Library here. I'm not going to talk about the full range of Scottish women novelists of this time, but I'm going to give you 4 women who could perhaps have been sisters to Jane Austen, or at a pinch an aunt or niece, if Austen family history had been slightly different and included a Scottish marriage somewhere along the way. My first Scottish sister is Elizabeth Hamilton, and this engraving is based on a really beautiful portrait by Sir Henry Raeburn, which is in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. Elizabeth Hamilton was born in Belfast to an Irish mother and Scottish father in 1758. Hamilton's father died while she was still a baby, and she was sent to live with her Scottish uncle and aunt on a farm near Stirling. While Hamilton's early education was typical of the respectable but impecunious middle class of the day, she spent hours learning to sew and recite Bible verses. She soon embarked on a course of strenuous self-improvement. Her great interest was in moral and educational philosophy, and Scotland was exactly the place where it was easy to get your hands on books involving these subjects. Hamilton read all the Scottish thinkers of her day, and in the words of her first biographer, like many solitary thinkers, was irresistibly compelled to become a writer. Like many other women of the time, she had domestic occupations, first keeping house for her uncle, then for her brother in London, and she enjoyed the stimulation of literary society. When she moved to London, for the first time she came into close personal contact with people who could share her intellectual interests. Later she would recall this time. Men of learning addressed themselves to me as to a being who was actually capable of thinking. Men of wit seemed to imagine that I could understand them, and both men and women, very superior to those with whom I'd been accustomed to associate, conversed with me so much upon a footing of equality that sometimes I was inclined to exclaim with the wee wife, "Surely this is no me." Hamilton's brother died unexpectedly in 1792, and this loss put her in a position where for the first time in her life, in her late 30s, she was responsible for no one else's welfare or domestic comforts. She began to write and publish fiction which allowed her to comment on the society in which she found herself. Her first book, published in 1796, used the persona of a Hindu Raja visiting England to give an outsider's perspective on the country. Her next book, Memoirs of Modern Philosophers, contained fictionalised, somewhat satirical portraits of recognisable figures such as William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, among others. This was first published in 1800 under the name of Geoffrey Jarvis, because, as Hamilton would later say, she knew how prejudiced people would be if they knew the real sex of the author. Hamilton went on to publish a serious work on the subject that interested her most, Letters on the Elementary Principles of Education, and this established her as a public figure and a writer. After this, all her works appeared under her own name as Elizabeth Hamilton, author of the Principles of Education. She wrote essays, more educational writings, and a fictionalised biography of the Roman heroine Agrippina. You can see why Elizabeth Hamilton, so esteemed in her day, has fallen through the modern literary cracks. How do you pigeonhole a woman who never visited India, but adopted the persona of a male Indian aristocrat, who kept mixing fiction and ideas, who wasn't a radical, but couldn't stop herself from constantly offering suggestions on how to improve society? She became sought after by aristocrats desirous of obtaining her services as governess to their children. Among the National Library's manuscripts is a journal by a young lady who describes her chance meeting with Miss Hamilton on holiday in the Lake District with the excited pleasure of an adoring fan. While Hamilton travelled throughout Britain, she had by now permanently settled in Edinburgh, where she participated in the intellectual and literary society of the day, and like all my other writers, put her principles into practice by participating in various charitable good works. It was here that she published her most successful work, The Cottagers of Glenburnie. This book instantly established itself in popular culture and captured people's imagination. Everyone could quote the improving Mrs. Mason and the irredeemable Mrs. McClarty, whose catchphrase, "I couldna be fashed," or "I can't be bothered," swept the nation. Sir Walter Scott ended Waverley, acknowledging that Hamilton, a female author whose genius is highly creditable to her country, had beaten him into print with her portrait of Scotland, although he pointed out that her concern to report faithfully on contemporary ways of life was different from his own desire to capture the past. The Cottagers of Glenburnie is such a morally improving work that it's perhaps hard now to understand just why it was so attractive to contemporary readers. Rather like Downton Abbey, it surveys the full range of society, from the aristocrats at the top to the cottagers of the title at the bottom, and tells their interconnecting stories, providing examples of the good and bad in each. At its centre is Mrs. Mason, who lives a life of exemplary domestic service. I kind of think she makes Carson, the butler in Downton Abbey, look like a Marxist revolutionary. She's so conservative and so loyal to her employers. Mrs. Mason retires to a Scottish village, expecting to be able to make herself useful to her cousin, Mrs. McClarty. Glenburnie, however, perhaps based on the villages Hamilton recalled from her childhood, turns out to be a far from model village. It's dirty and run down, and the people's motto, when faced with any suggestion for improvement, is the famous "I couldn't be fashed, I can't be bothered." Mrs. McClarty's house, for instance, was by no means inviting. The walls were on one side of the door completely covered from view by the contents of a great dunghill. On the other, directly under the window, was a squashy pool, framed by the dirty water thrown from the house. Things don't improve when she goes inside for a cup of tea and discovers that in traditional Scottish fashion, as Elizabeth Hamilton tells it, Mrs. McClarty has a huge Dutch press full of fine table linen, but no practical dishcloths. "You have a noble stock of linen, cousin," said Mrs. Mason. "Few farmers' houses in England could produce the like, but I think this is rather too fine for common use." "For common use?" cried Mrs. McClarty. "No, no, we're no such fools as to put our napery to use. I have a dozen tablecloths in that press, 30 years old, that were never laid upon a table. I've 9 of my own making, that never saw the sun but at the washing. You needn't be telling us at England." On saying this, the good woman pulled out from between the seed tub and her husband's dirty shoes a long blackened rag, and with it rubbed one of the pewter plates with which she stepped into the closet for a roll of butter. "There," says she, "I'm sure you'll say you never ate better butter in your life. There's no one on Glenburnie better kye than ours. I hope you'll eat heartily, and I'm sure you're heartily welcome." And one of the children who's come into the house with Mrs. Mason cries, "Look, there are the marks of a thumb and 2 fingers. Do scrape it off, it is so nasty." "Dear me," said Mrs. McClarty, "I didn't mind it being stirring the fire, and my hands were a wee bit sooty, but it will soon scrape off. There's a dirty knife, will do it in a minute." Clearly, there's a lot of work for Mrs. Mason to do here. Mrs. McClarty comes across as the forerunner of Rabsy Nesbitt and a host of other celebrations of the resistance of the working class to being improved. Glenburnie itself becomes a model village, but Mrs. McClarty ends the book, still contemptuous of those who were now so saucy as to pretend they couldn't sit down in comfort in a house that wasn't clean. The Cottagers was an instant success, and the editions that we hold in the National Library show it was read by all social classes, even the villagers it was aimed at. And I've got some illustrations here that show you. You can see the far left is the title page of the first edition, which is kind of a proper novel aimed at novel-reading middle classes. And the other 2 title pages are title pages from editions that were marketed actually at Cottagers, which is not the case by any means with the bulk of the novels published during this period. Meanwhile, Hamilton herself became something of a Mrs. Mason, involved in founding a house of industry for indigent women in Edinburgh. But by now in her 50s, she also increasingly suffered from ill health. She continued to write, mostly non-fictional works on her favourite subject of education, but she died in 1816. My next author had a very different life to the independent Miss Hamilton. Mary Brunton was that rare thing, a happily married authoress. She was born Mary Balfour in the Orkney island of Bury in 1778, and her family history is exactly the kind of story she wrote about in her novels. Her mother was the child of a distinguished military family, her father the younger son of an Orkney laird, who became a successful gentleman farmer. In 1798, Mary married Alexander Brunton, a clergyman who became minister of the new Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh in 1802, and subsequently Professor of Hebrew Languages at Edinburgh University. This sounds like a very respectable match, but it came after a courtship straight out of the pages of her own novels. Mary's parents disapproved of the liaison with a young minister of no particular family, rank or income, who'd been employed to tutor her brothers, and young Miss Balfour eloped by moonlight in a boat which her lover rowed to the mainland. Happily married, Mary became, by all accounts, a good minister's wife. She also began to write, at first for personal amusement, until, as her husband recalled, once she appealed to an intimate friend who was present, whether he would not be my publisher, in other words, her husband's publisher. He consented readily, but added that he would at least as willingly publish a book of her own writing. This seemed at the time to strike her as something the possibility of which had never occurred to her before, and she asked more than once whether he was in earnest. Spurred by the idea of publishing, Brunton set to work and produced Self-Control, which was printed in 1811. This book was an immediate hit, going through 4 editions in the first year of publication. Brunton herself gave her background in the book's dedication. Till I began Self-Control, I'd never in my life written anything but a letter or a recipe, excepting a few hundreds of vile rhymes, from which I desisted by the time I gained the wisdom of 15 years. Therefore, I was so ignorant of the art on which I was entering that I formed scarcely any plan for my tale. I merely intended to show the power of the religious principle in bestowing self-command, and to bear testimony against a maxim as immoral as indelicate, that a reformed ring makes the best husband. Modest about her own success, Brunton was thrown off course in her authorial career when Scott's Waverley was published in 1814. She wrote in a letter to a friend, "It is very unfortunate in coming after Waverley, by far the most splendid exhibition of talent in the novel way which has appeared since the days of Fielding and Smollett. There seems little doubt that it comes from the pen of Scott. What a competitor for poor little me." But Mary's husband and other friends encouraged her to continue, and Discipline, her next novel, appeared in 1814. I think it's more a testament to the revolutionary impact of Waverley than evidence of any weakness in Discipline that Brunton was so in awe of Scott's achievement. Discipline is not a tale about a lost Scottish past, but an invocation of an all too real Scottish present, with a first-person narrative from the heroine which makes it very readable today. Brunton planned to continue writing and began Emily, her next. This was never finished. It was published with a memoir by her husband, after her death cut her promising literary career short in 1818. She died at the age of 40 during the stillbirth of her first child. My next novelist is Susan Ferrier, born in 1782. She lived in George Street in the New Town. Ferrier has been called the Scottish Jane Austen, and they came from similar backgrounds in the professional middle class, with links through work and family to a higher social sphere. The daughter of a prominent lawyer, Ferrier kept house for her father from the age of 22, following her mother's early death and her sister's marriage. In the small Edinburgh society of the day, she was well acquainted with Sir Walter Scott, among other literary lions. Equally important to Ferrier's development as a writer was her father's role as legal agent to the 5th Duke of Argyll. Through visits to the Duke's estate at Inverary with her father, Ferrier gained the knowledge of Highland life and landscape which would fill her books. She also formed a friendship with Charlotte Clavering, the Duke's granddaughter, and this is Charlotte. In 1809, these 2 young women decided to write a novel together. Charlotte soon dropped out, and the book became Ferrier's first published work, Marriage. This is probably the best known of all the novels I'm talking about this evening, and it's certainly the easiest to get your hands on. Published anonymously, whether because Ferrier did not want to be known as an authoress, or to hide what soon became known, that several of the characters were recognisable portraits of well-known members of Edinburgh society. Marriage has won praise, and I think slightly intimidated critics ever since because of its satirical wit. The opening chapters of Marriage describe the spoilt English heiress, Lady Juliana, brought up to do nothing but look beautiful and play with her pug dogs. She elopes with impoverished Scottish younger son Henry Douglas, and is shocked to find that she has to live in his family's decrepit Highland castle. These opening chapters are among the best to be found in any novel in English. The comedy is perfectly balanced and beautifully written. Here is Lady Juliana's first evening with Douglas's family. The young ladies, eager for the delights of music and dancing, now entered, followed by Call the piper dressed in the native garb. After a little strutting and puffing, the pipes were fairly set a-going in Call's most spirited manner. But vain would be the attempt to describe Lady Juliana's horror and amazement at the hideous sounds that for the first time assailed her ear. She flew shrieking to her husband and threw herself trembling into his arms, while he called loudly to the self-delighted Call to stop. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" cried the whole family, gathering round. Matter, repeated Douglas furiously. You frightened Lady Juliana to death with your infernal music. What did you mean, turning fiercely to the astonished piper, by blowing that confounded bladder? Poor Coll gasped with astonishment, for never before had his performance on the bagpipe been heard but with admiration and applause. A bonny bargain indeed that canna stand the pipes, said the old gentleman, Douglas's father, as he went puffing down the room. She's no the wife for a Hielandman. Confounded blather indeed. By my faith, you're no blate. Ferrier went on to publish 2 other novels, The Inheritance and Destiny, both well received when first published, but now far less well known. I think the sheer perfection of the construction of the first chapters of Marriage, their blend of plot and character, and the energy that comes from the originality of the situation, has often meant that people find the rest of her writings fall short by comparison. Ferrier is in general much more discursive and likes her novels to range widely. All of them cover many years and take their heroines to a variety of places. If you're looking for 2 inches of ivory, as Jane Austen famously described her novels, you will be disappointed, but I'll come back to that question. After 1834, no more novels appeared, though a fragment, Maplehurst Manor, was published for the first time in the catalogue of the 1982 exhibition the National Library held to mark the bicentenary of Ferrier's birth. We know from letters held in the National Library that Ferrier's publishers encouraged her to write more because there was such demand for her books. In reply, she explained that she suffered from failing eyesight, which made writing impossible because she had to sit in darkened rooms and avoid lights. Ferrier died in 1854, having turned her energies from literature to support for the good causes associated with her free church religious beliefs, such as temperance and the abolition of slavery. Finally, the youngest of my novelists, and my own personal favourite, Catherine Sinclair. Sinclair's early life bears some resemblance to Susan Ferrier's. Like Ferrier, she was the child of a prominent Edinburgher, in her case, Sir John Sinclair, described in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography as agricultural improver, politician, and codifier of useful knowledge. Sinclair is the youngest of my authors, born in 1800, just when her father was in his prime as the originator of the massive survey, the Statistical Account of Scotland. Like Ferrier, Sinclair was a home daughter who spent her time caring for her father after her mother's death. She grew up in Edinburgh's New Town. At one point, the family residence was Bute House, which tells you the kind of background she came from. From the age of 14, Sinclair served as her father's secretary, and the demands of answering his correspondence and dealing with her own were what taught her to write. She began to write for publication in her 30s, beginning with children's tales originally produced to entertain her nieces and nephews. Her best-known book has a significant role in the history of children's literature. Holiday House, published in 1839, remained a nursery favourite for a century because it's one of the first books to give a realistic picture of children who are naturally curious, untidy, mischievous and argumentative. Although itself this is a moral and religious book, it doesn't have unnaturally high standards for children's behaviour, like so many of its predecessors, and it paved the way for children's stories to become amusing and attractive to children themselves. Meanwhile, Catherine Sinclair was beginning the series of books I'm talking about today. Novels about young ladies on the brink of entering society. Modern Accomplishments and its sequel Modern Society inevitably recall to a modern reader Jane Austen's scene from Pride and Prejudice, where Bingley is amazed at the young ladies of his acquaintance. They all paint tables, cover screens and net purses, he says. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I'm sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished. And of course Miss Bingley chips in with a long list of other superficial accomplishments. Darcy adds, all this she must possess, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial to the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. And of course Elizabeth Bennet caps this with, I'm no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Modern Accomplishments is an extended treatise on this subject. What makes the perfect young lady? Is it the education Matilda Howard receives from her sensible governess and wise Aunt Olivia, or the cultivation of showy accomplishments Eleanor Fitzpatrick learns from Miss Marrowbout? Eleanor's mother clearly belongs to the Miss Bingley school of accomplishments. Does she play on the harp and sing in perfection, asked Lady Fitzpatrick, who professed the most enthusiastic love of music and generally interrupted it with a profusion of affected exclamations, coming in at the most inappropriate places, and nodding in time with her head in regular measure, but generally half a note out of time. Catherine Sinclair is the most overtly religious of all of these writers, but she's also the easiest to read, and she conjures up through her dialogues characters who leap off the page and are instantly recognisable. Take Miss Barbara Neville, one of three sisters, for instance, who, in her youth, had always been much overlooked, owing to the superior brilliancy of her younger sisters. And with the same love of excitement, she tried to dress like Lady Fitzpatrick and to talk like Lady Howard, but somehow it never succeeded, and the case seemed beyond all remedy, till at length it was suddenly announced, as publicly and decidedly as if she'd been going to be married, that Miss Barbara Neville had become serious. Barbara's religious dissipations, as Sinclair calls them, greatly enliven the novel. Brilliantly, Sinclair never actually shows us the eccentric and pious circle that Barbara occupies, but lets her be constantly talking about them, so that the reader, like Barbara's relatives, feels they know all about Miss Rachel Stoddart, whose every word is deferred to as gospel. Meanwhile, quite realistically, Lady Fitzpatrick and Lady Howard affected not to perceive any change whatsoever in Miss Neville, which annoyed her more than the severest persecution could have done. In that she might have gloried, but there was no glory whatsoever in being addressed as a mere everyday mortal. Perhaps today, when Scotland has become a more secular society, it's slightly easier to accept Sinclair's religion as a historical curiosity. Now her books are no longer seen, as they were at the time, as valuable tools in the battle to save souls. I find it's perfectly possible, when reading for pleasure, to skim past her more explicit religious outpourings. I have to confess, if you read 19th century fiction for pleasure, you do quite often skip past religiosity, emotional scenes, any passage in Dickens beginning something like "Bless thy simple heart, poor Tom Pinch," skipping, very invaluable technique. It can also be helpful, I think, to draw parallels with the enthusiasms of today. Miss Barbara Neville might be an environmental activist today, enthusiastically insisting her sisters use the latest eco-friendly cleaners and recycle their every piece of rubbish. Sinclair's passionate defence of what she saw as the only true religion probably makes her later adult novels, such as Jane Bouverie and Beatrice, much less palatable to modern readers, unless, like me, you have a secret weakness for mid-Victorian chronicles. But her religion was what made her popular and commercially successful across Britain and America in the 19th century. My mid-Victorian edition of Modern Accomplishments carries an advertisement for Beatrice, the Great Protestant Tale, saying it's already sold 30,000 copies within a month of being published in New York, and with reviews from magazines ranging from The Spectator to the local newspaper of a small Pennsylvania town, which says of Beatrice that the main objection against it is that those who commence the reading of it forget to eat and sleep until it's finished. I've talked about how all of these women combined their writing with charitable works, but Sinclair was exceptionally philanthropic and well known in Edinburgh for her interest in schools, girls' education, soup kitchens and other charities. It was for this, as much as her novel writing, that a monument was erected to her by popular subscription on her death in 1864. And this is the monument. It's perhaps symbolic of the fate of these women novelists, that whereas Sir Walter Scott's monument still stands 400 feet high in splendid isolation in Princes Street Gardens, a national landmark instantly recognisable, Sinclair's 60-foot memorial is forgotten and overshadowed by trees at the corner of Queen Street and North Charlotte Street. So now I've introduced these women and their books to you, how can I persuade you to read them? First of all of these novels are very, very funny. For all their stern morality, Mary Brinton, Catherine Sinclair and Elizabeth Hamilton were possessed of a dry sense of humour which enlivens their novels. Mary Brinton, for instance, has her heroine Laura pay a visit to her landlady's daughter, where she was soon engaged with Mrs. Dawkins in a dissertation on various branches of household economy. And to the eternal degradation, says Mary Brinton, of her character as a heroine, actually listened with interest to the means of improving the cleanliness, beauty and comfort of her dwelling. One person who Laura meets at this London gathering takes a trip to Scotland once and has never forgotten it, asking Laura's father sympathetically on the subject of kilts. And do then their wild men make you wear them little red and green petticoats? Susan Ferrier creates a gallery of comic characters throughout her novels, starting with Marriage, which gives us not one but two rivals for Lady Catherine de Bourgh. First, Miss Jackie, the dominant one of the three sisters who rule the domestic roost in the Scottish castle, and then the fearsome Lady Maclaughlan, and this is she in the middle of this illustration here, who says to a guest, "You will find everything right here, child, and if anything should be wrong, you must think it right. I never suffer anything to be thought wrong here." This intimidating lady is married to the microscopically small invalid Sir Sampson, who makes a memorable first appearance in the novel being removed from his carriage. The lackey, meanwhile, advanced to the carriage, and putting in both his hands as if to catch something, he pulled forth a small bundle of the house. And this is the illustration, this illustration is of this scene. "Pray sit down, Lady Maclaughlan," cried her three friends all at once, each tendering a chair. "Sit down," repeated she. "Why, what should I sit down for? I choose to stand. I don't like to sit. I never sit at home, do I, Sir Sampson?" Turning to the little warrior, who, having been seized with a violent fit of coughing on his entrance, had now sunk back, seemingly quite exhausted. "How very distressing Sir Sampson's cough is," said the sympathising Miss Grizzy. "Distressing, child? No, it's not in the least distressing. How can a thing be distressing that does no harm? He's much the better of it. It's the only exercise he gets." "Oh, well, indeed, if that's the case, it would be 1,000 pities to stop it," replied the accommodating spinster. "No, it wouldn't be the least pity to stop it," returned Lady Maclaughlan in her loud, authoritative tone, "because though it's not distressing, it's very disagreeable." Susan Ferrier is a real comic novelist, a novelist who creates a comic world governed by recognisably ridiculous rules and peopled by a gallery of eccentrics whose behaviour generates more and more silly situations which sometimes topple over into the tragedy of the absurd. Although she has plenty of serious moments and emotional dramas, Ferrier has an acute eye for what is really ridiculous about the way people behave. Quite a lot of critics seem to find Susan Ferrier's sense of humour very problematic. She's so satirical, they complain, it gets in the way of the reader's sympathy for the characters. It is here, I think, that the frequent comparison of Ferrier to Jane Austen really works to Ferrier's disadvantage. Though anyone who chooses to begin a novel, as Ferrier does The Inheritance, with the sentence, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that there is nothing so deeply rooted in human nature as that of pride," brings this comparison on themselves. Although she writes novels focused on young women and their relationships, Ferrier is no more a domestic novelist or a romantic novelist than Thackeray or Dickens. Very few women are ever identified primarily as comic novelists, and even fewer women who wrote centuries ago are allowed to have written with a sense of humour. Literary criticism has tended to laugh at, not with, women who wore hooped skirts and engaged in pious moral reflections. But once you treat Ferrier as much as the precursor to Dickens as the heir to Austen, her novels start to make a lot more sense. How else to read one of the most splendid scenes she wrote in The Inheritance? We spent the novel learning how the arrogant Lord Rossville cares primarily for the dignity of his name and the observation of propriety, and making the acquaintance of the awful Miss Pratt, who spends her life inveigling her way into other people's houses so that she can gather gossip about them, invariably getting hold of the wrong end of the stick, and infuriating her hosts by her ability to steamroller her way into seeing the rooms they would prefer she kept out of. Then comes a snowstorm at Lord Rossville's home. Suddenly the snow ceased. The clouds rolled away, and a red, brassy glare of the setting sun fell abruptly on this moving phenomenon and disclosed to view a stately, full-plumed hearse. There was something so terrific, yet so picturesque in its appearance, as it ploughed its way through waves of snow, its sable plumes and gilded skulls nodding and grinning in the now livid glimmering of the fast-sinking sun, that they all stood transfixed with alarm and amazement. At length the prodigy drew near, followed by 2 attendants on horseback. It drew up at the grand entrance, the servants gathered round, one of the men began to remove the end board, that threshold of death. This is, gasped the Earl as he tried to throw open the window, but the window was frozen, and his fury was turned from the dead to the living, for there was lifted out not a corpse, but the warm, sentient, and somewhat discomfited figure of Miss Pratt. Whether the contents of the hearse should be permitted to enter his castle walls from such a conveyance was a doubt in itself so weighty for the moment as to overpower every faculty of mind and body. And the Earl tries to debate him, has a long debate whether he should let Miss Pratt in or not, because on the one hand she's a relative and therefore he's very concerned about propriety and he should admit his relatives. On the other hand, she's just come in a hearse and he's very concerned about who could tell what distemper she might not bring in her train. Miss Pratt, however, blithely enters the house, promises the men with the hearse a night's food and lodging at the castle, regardless of Lord Rossville's wishes. And then it turns out that the hearse had been conveying a radical who had made his money in trade to the funeral. Death, in its most dignified attitude, with all its proudest trophies, would have been an appalling spectacle to Lord Rossville, but in its present and vulgar and almost burlesque form, it was almost insupportable. Ferrier describes the long, restless night of Lord Rossville as the ever-falling snow decreases the likelihood of either his unwelcome guest or the hearse departing. And when his servant entered in the morning, he found his master a lifeless corpse. But enough of death. Since I presume I'm speaking to people who are fans of Jane Austen, you will want to know, what about the romance? Are there heroines to measure up to Elizabeth Bennet or Anne Elliot? Will you find a Captain Wentworth or a Darcy in the pages of these books? I have to say at the outset, there are no wet shirt scenes in any of these novels, though of course not in Jane Austen's novels either, and who knows what an Andrew Davies could bring to an adaptation of Marriage or Self-Control. I defy anyone to find a way of sexing up the cottages of Glen Burnie. We do have field day. We do have heroes with whom Davies would have a field day, such as Ronald Malcolm in The Inheritance, who makes one memorable appearance after being lost at sea as a tall and sunburnt youth, coarsely and scantily clad, but with something wild and noble in his air and aspect. More Darcy-like is the reserved Sir Alfred Douglas, the hero of modern society, who spends most of the novel fending off all the young women who keep trying to impress him. Sir Alfred Douglas had retired to a distant corner of the room, externally in a state of suspended animation. His eyes were half closed and overshadowed by the dark clusters of his hair. His head was thrown back, his arms folded, and his legs stretched out to their fullest extent, so that Matilda, the heroine, could have laughed to see how impregnably he had fortified himself against the possibility of being invaded by anyone. Sinclair also gives him a best friend whom some may find more attractive, the witty Mr. Grant, who enjoys nothing better than teasing his friends. In modern society, these two form with glamorous Eleanor and virtuous Matilda, a foursome whose relationships go back and forth throughout the novel. Eleanor clearly loves Mr. Grant, but once she becomes a rich heiress, they both proclaim it would never be right for him without a fortune to marry her. But Sinclair shows that neither of them can really quite give up their preference for the other, in spite of her dislike of his poverty and his of her pride. And meanwhile, Matilda suspects that Sir Alfred has feelings for her, but for some reason he always seems to hold back, and how can a well-mannered young lady try to find out how he really feels? Mary Brunton gives us quite a different leading couple in Self-Control. Laura is beautiful, calm, rational, and possessed of an almost irritating ability to manage perfectly in every situation, only redeemed by her tendency to faint in moments of great stress. She also hates that her tall and distinguished figure, as Brunton says, constantly draws attention from other people. Mary Brunton is very gentle in the way in which she reveals how, in spite of all Laura's reason, she sometimes deludes herself into believing that what her heart really wants is a rational decision, as with her unwillingness to give up her first love for Colonel Hargrave, even after she decides she can never marry him. In 1813, Jane Austen commented on Self-Control in a not entirely admiring manner. "I'm looking over Self-Control again," she wrote in a letter, "and my opinion is confirmed of its being an excellently meant, elegantly written work, without anything of nature or probability in it. I declare I do not know whether Laura's passage down the American River is not the most natural possible everyday thing she ever does. And Laura's passage down the American River is an escape from being kidnapped on a canoe. She paddles single-handedly down the rapids. So I think calling that natural possible everyday Jane Austen does not approve. A lot of people have taken this quotation as proof that Self-Control must be an inferior novel, because how could it not be if Jane Austen considers it so? But I find it a very interesting thing for Jane Austen to say, because I see her and Mary Brunton as occupying something of the same territory, but doing some things very differently. Elizabeth Bennet is seen as slightly daring because she walks through the fields from Netherfield to Pemberley. Anne Elliot and Eleanor Dashwood are heroic in their efforts to retrench when their families lose money. Mary Brunton's heroines, Laura and Ellen, naturally think of earning money and independently keeping themselves through their own energies when they find themselves suddenly impoverished. They wander alone through the seedier parts of London and Edinburgh in search of work. Where Austen only ever alludes to what she sees as real vice, the elopements of Lydia and Wickham, or Maria and Henry Crawford, for instance, take place off stage, Mary Brunton thinks nothing of showing us exactly what happens when a man tries to seduce the young lady or has an affair with a married one. Where Austen is famous for her refusal to imagine the conversation of gentlemen alone together, Brunton dives in and tells us their exchanges. Self-Control was a well-known, critically esteemed novel. It was published slightly before Jane Austen's own writings made it into print, and it far outsold them in those early years. Is Austen's criticism of Self-Control a determination not to let herself be too impressed by the woman whose novels were doing far better in the literary marketplace than her own? Is she giving herself room for her own original ideas, just as decades later Charlotte Bronte would do with her criticisms of what she saw as Jane Austen's lack of passion? Even Mary Brunton herself recognised Laura's passage down the American River when, right at the end of the book, she's melodramatically kidnapped and taken to remotest Canada as the weakest part of the novel. But even this, I think, can be justified. It's very clear that Brunton really enjoyed writing self-control, and the last quarter of the book consists of a series of problem after problem, preventing what by now has become apparent will be the natural ending, the moment when hero and heroine get together. It's almost as if, having created this independent, resourceful and intelligent heroine, Brunton starts to throw all her creative energies towards trying to avoid the moment when Laura has to stop being so beautifully self-reliant. Read in this way, the last desperate throw of the villain's dice, the kidnapping, is also the last desperate expression of Brunton's own desire to postpone an ending. While Laura's final heroic voyage is one last extreme expression of her ability to find her way out of any situation through her own efforts, without needing to be rescued by any hero. So much for the heroine of self-control. In the very first chapter, we encounter the villain. I think self-control almost tells the story of what would have happened if Eleanor Dashwood, rather than Marianne, had fallen in love with Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility at the age of 17. Laura was just 17, and Colonel Hargrave was the most ardent, the most favoured of lovers. His person was symmetry itself. His manners had all the fascination that vivacity and intelligence joined to the highest polish can bestow. Yet it was not Hargrave whom Laura loved, for the being on whom she doted had no resemblance to him but in externals. It was a creature of her own imagination, yet impassioned as the wild streams of fiction. This ideal being, clothed with the fine form and adorned with the insinuating manners of Hargrave, what heart of woman could resist? Laura's was completely captivated. But in this very first chapter, we discover that Hargrave is not all that Laura imagines. He is, in fact, devoid of the self-control which is the theme of the novel, and unable to control his passion for Laura, he tries to seduce her. Brunton's language is formal and matinate, and it would be easy to dismiss Laura's resistance to Hargrave's physical advances as prudish. But I happened to be rereading this passage in preparation for this talk during a week that accusations about sexual harassment and politics were all over the headlines. And if you think about seduction as power play, Hargrave's insistence that his feelings deserve satisfaction regardless of what Laura wants, a whole different perspective. Hargrave's inability to control himself, tempted sometimes by the idea of living up to Laura's standards, and sometimes by his desire to get exactly what he wants, is what drives the plot of the novel. Though I don't want to spoil it for you by telling you everything Laura discovers about him in the course of the book. If Hargrave is an alpha male whose manner and beauty make him irresistibly attractive, the real hero of the novel, Montague de Courcy, takes longer to make his charms known. One modern reader describes him as adorable in a sort of a geeky way, and with his chemistry experiments, domestic tendencies, and habit of confiding his love for Laura to his very sensible mother, a geek is how he comes across. Watching Laura fall out of love with Hargrave and in love with de Courcy, and finally realise that she is in love with de Courcy, and this second attachment might be better than her first raptures for Hargrave, is perhaps the most enjoyable part of reading Self-Control. And dare I say it, it's a much more believable second attachment than the way Marianne Dashwood ends up marrying Colonel Brandon in Sense and Sensibility. Mary Brunton certainly enjoyed writing it, and this comes through in the book. I shall never conquer her indifference, said Montague to his mother. This is of Laura after an incident where he's rashly taken her hands and Laura's been very upset. Had you seen her frozen look of displeasure, you would have been convinced. And how, my dear Montague, could you expect Miss Montraville to receive such freedom? Like a little village coquette gasping at the prospect of a first lover? If you are convinced that your secret would still be heard without pleasure, you must redouble your caution to preserve it. Montague promised to be guarded, and withdrew to seek in his laboratory a refuge from despondence. The pursuits of science and virtue have this advantage peculiar to themselves, that there is reward in the labour even though the success be only partial, and in half an hour all Montague's cares were absorbed in muriatic acid. So how different are Jane Austen's Scottish sisters? Certainly, there's always a sense in these novels of the Scottish background, which if you're used to reading the very English Jane Austen, you may find disconcerting, or perhaps interestingly different. The Scottish element crops up in 1,000 little details. References to shops on Princes Street and assemblies in Edinburgh, the robust independent manner of those who in English novels of the same period come across as knowing their place, whether spinster cousins or Highland cottage dwellers, the many descriptions of the beauties of Highland scenery. Several of our heroines are said to speak Gaelic. Mary Brunton makes it Laura's native language. Susan Ferrier's awful minister, Mr. MacDowell, who's surely a relation of Mr. Collins, conducts services in Gaelic for his parishioners. Scots is the language not only of servants and farmers, but of older Scottish aristocrats, such as Susan Ferrier's Highland chief Glenroy. One thing I think all these novelists have in common, and it's something that a lot of people have found missing from Jane Austen, is a concern for the wider society in which they find themselves. Susan Ferrier and Elizabeth Hamilton in particular are very aware that outside civilised Edinburgh, on the big estates and in the farming villages, there is a poverty and a lack of knowledge of what were then the latest farming techniques, hygiene and medicine. Hamilton, very much a daughter of the Scottish Enlightenment, wrote The Cottagers of Glenburnie with the aim of using fiction to bring awareness of improvements to a wider audience. And contemporaries do record that her novels, and it's very hard to tell how true this is, but contemporaries do record that the Cottagers of Glenburnie did make a difference. You have people saying, oh, I visited this village 4 years ago before the Cottagers of Glenburnie came out, and it was in a terrible condition, and I just came back recently, and everything has been improved. It was all thanks to the Cottagers of Glenburnie. Ferrier, by nature more satirical, gives a more detailed picture of what, by the time she was writing, was a very decaying feudal system in the Highlands. Destiny begins with the portrait of Glenroy, the Highland chief who detested London, despised every part of the globe save Scotland, hated all music save that of the bagpipes, had little enjoyment in any society except that of his friends and followers, and when he spoke of the world, meant only his own country and clan. Ferrier leaves the reader in no doubt of the evils of this old system, where Glenroy insists on overbearing displays of hospitality to guests who have to fawn on him, wasting food, drink and money, without any concern for managing his estate wisely for his tenants. But the new ways are no better. Glenroy is contrasted with the miserly Inch Oran, who's made his money in business and refuses to spend it at all, and with young Sir Reginald, who flies to England and a life in high society, leaving his Scottish estate to fend for himself. I think that all of these authors, however, have their own unique vision of the world, and they communicate it in novels which I hope I've shown can still be enjoyed today. I don't know whether they will ever gain the place in modern readers' hearts which Jane Austen occupies, but they will certainly entertain you, hold your interest, and sometimes make you laugh out loud. Their anomalous position in literary history, caught between two of the giants in the history of the novel, makes it hard for them to get the attention they deserve in modern times. But now that you've found these writers, I hope you will listen to the claim that their books have to your attention. There were, of course, many other Scottish women who wrote for publication during this period. Christian Isabel Johnson, whose Clan Alban rivaled the Cottagers of Librarian as a best-selling national tale for Sidney Waverley, and who, when she wasn't writing best-selling novels, was compiling cookbooks, editing magazines, and writing articles and reviews. I haven't the space here to treat of the sisters Anna Maria and Jane Porter, both famous at the time for their novels, or to talk about Anne Grant of Lagan, whose fascinating letters and memoirs recall her childhood in pre-revolutionary America and her adult life in a remote Highland village. Never mind poets, from the aristocratic Lady Carolina Nairn to dairymaid Janet Little. But I will leave you with a charming recipe for what makes a novelist, which Anna Maria Porter wrote in a letter in 1816. Take a sprinkling of taste, an ounce of observation, a whole pound of early experience, bought at as dear rate as possible. Then add the very smallest pinch of book learning, and you have the talent of a novelist. Pray remember, I pretend to no higher title.